Thank you for joining the Council on Foundations Post-Election Analysis webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If at any time during the webinar you have technical difficulties and need to access the help desk, click on the help icon on the right-hand side of your screen up at the very top. We'll be taking questions throughout the webinar, and you can type those to us also in your toolbar under questions. Type those to us, and we'll field questions towards the end. If you are on a telephone, it's definitely best to be on a landline. And there will be a recording of this webinar made available on the Council's website in the next week. And now I'll turn it over to Sue Santa, Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Legal Affairs at the Council.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on a Friday afternoon after a very exciting election week. I know those of us who thrive on the political world always love this first week of November because it definitely proves to be exciting and eventful, and we have things we expect and things we didn't quite expect. And we're going to look at a lot of that today in this webinar. We're also going to take a quick look at what this might mean for one of the issues that we absolutely care about all the time, but certainly in the coming Congress, which would be tax reform. On that note, though, I do want to say that the Council will have lots of programming on tax reform, so we will touch on the issue today, get into it a little bit, but we will not dig terribly deeply into that. We are very, very fortunate today to be joined by three true experts in the political world. I'm going to introduce all three of them to you right up front here and then turn over to our panelists as we go. First, you're going to hear from Josh Kraushaar, who is the political editor for National Journal and pens the weekly Against the Grain column. Since he has been with Atlantic Media, he's had several different roles, including managing editor for politics at National Journal, executive editor, and editor-in-chief of The Hotline. Josh plays a really critical role in shaping National Journal's overall political coverage. And among the many, many things that he does, he has appeared as a political analyst on television and radio, including Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, NPR, and C-SPAN. After we hear from Josh, we're going to hear from two gentlemen whom those of you who join us for webinars throughout the year have heard from before. They are fabulous political consultants from both sides of the aisle. From the D side of the aisle, we will hear from Rob Leonard, who for more than 3 decades has been a distinguished practitioner in that small circle of federal tax and budget policy advocates. Rob served as chief counsel and staff director of the Committee on Ways and Means in the House and as chief majority tax counsel of the committee. During his 20-year tenure on Capitol Hill, he was centrally involved really in all major tax and budget legislation at that time, including the Tax Reform Act of 1976, the Economic Recovery Act of 81, the Tax Act of 82, Deficit Reduction Act of 84. We could go on, but most notably, of course, the Tax Reform Act of 86. We are also going to be joined from the wonderful Ken Keyes, who represents the Republican side of the aisle, and as many of you know, Ken is the Managing Director of Federal Policy Group. He, too, has decades of experience, and gentlemen, I'm just sorry to say that I think between the two of you, you have multiple decades of experience on Capitol Hill, and at many junctures, you actually were together on Capitol Hill on other sides of the aisle. Ken was on the Hill at about the same time that Rob was. He served as Chief of Staff for the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation, and he oversaw the development of major tax legislation, including the Tax Reform Act of 97. He has, in addition to being with Federal Policy Group, he's been with several other firms as well, and we are always thrilled to have both Rob and Ken join us and give us their perspectives. Now, before we dive in, I do want to remind everyone that all of the participants on the call are muted by us, not because we don't want to hear from you, but because we all know the conundrum of having lots of people. But you absolutely can put in your questions via typing them in. And for our speakers who are not muted by us, we just do remind you that when you aren't speaking, sometimes it's best just to manually put your phones on mute so that there's a clear line for everyone listening to our speakers. So with that, I am thrilled to turn over the microphone to Josh, who from the National Journal perspective is going to tell us what happened on Tuesday. Josh, great to have you with us.
Thanks a lot, Sue, for that really warm introduction. And like you said, all of us in the political world are still catching our breath from a pretty significant midterm election on Tuesday night. And you know, I'm going to give sort of the macro, big picture look at what happened, what are the big implications from that, and sort of look at the analysis that we can draw, at least from the early, from the results and the early takeaways that we can make. The big picture, I just wanted to, just going beyond the 2014 elections, 2014 marks the 4th out of 5 elections going back to 2006 where we've seen wave elections, a huge dominant performance by one party in the national vote over the other. In 2006, Democrats took control of both houses, 30 seats in the House, 6 seats in the Senate, and really capitalized on Democratic dissatisfaction with the president's handling, on President Bush's handling in the war in Iraq. In 2008, Democrats were winning House seats in some of the most conservative territory in the country. President Obama was competitive in some of these districts. Turnout among Democratic core voters was through the roof, and Democrats held a supermajority in 2009 in the Senate of 60 seats, and in the House they had a significant majority than they had in some time. 2010 was a reversal of that, and Republicans gained 63 net seats in the House. They made big inroads in the Senate. It was a big, I believe, the president, who didn't call this election a thumping, but made remarks recognizing the scope of the 2010 Republican victory, which came as a shock to many Democrats, at least when it came to the composition of the House. 2012 was a little more of an exception to the rule, with Obama losing ground from his 2008 original election, but still a pretty decisive victory for Democrats. But 2014, again, as we saw from Tuesday night's results, was a decisive victory in all aspects for Republicans, whether you look at the House, where Republicans have their largest majority since at least the 1940s, depending on some of these recounts and final counts. It could be their biggest majority since the Congress that was elected in 1928 during the Hoover administration. Republicans they gained 7 seats in the Senate, but it looks like they'll gain 9 once on the recount and ballots are counted in Alaska, and then pending the results of the Louisiana runoff in December, which is looking very favorable for Bill Cassidy, the Republican nominee. And then the governorships, which we'll go into in a little more detail in a little bit, also a big Republican night across the board. So this was a true wave election. The voters are behaving in a much more parliamentary fashion than they did generations ago. Among the 87% of voters in exit polls who approved of Obama, 87% of the voters, rather, who approved of Obama in the exit polls supported Democratic congressional candidates. 83% who disapproved of Obama backed Republicans. There's not a lot. I mean, you saw this in the southern races that Democrats lost single-handedly. There's not much difference. People aren't making a difference between President Obama and perhaps a more moderate Democratic senator like a Mark Pryor or a Democratic candidate like Allison Lenigan Grimes. Michelle Nunn, who was hyped as one of the better Democratic recruits, got 24% of the white vote in Georgia. President Obama in 2008 got 24% of the white vote in Georgia. People are voting based on party labels like you would see in a parliamentary system. They're not voting on the candidates in these midterm elections, which is a big change from even a couple decades ago during the Clinton years. It's a big challenge for Democrats too in these congressional midterm elections. And also, finally, in terms of the big macro picture, the environment, which favored Republicans, the national vote favored Republicans by about a 7-point margin, trumped the tactics that Democrats were talking about constantly, about the Bannock Street Project and their $60 million investment to turn out Democratic voters in these big battleground states. But one of the underplayed stories from the midterms is that Democrats actually did a pretty good job, in some cases a very good job, of turning out the Obama coalition, their core voters. The underplayed story is that Republicans didn't really talk too much about their ground game, about their own get-out-the-vote efforts, and they not only came close, in some states they surpassed the Democratic Party's efforts in turning out their own disaffected, conservative, older voters in general, and they matched the Democrats in every step of the way. One example of that is in Colorado, which is where Bannock Street is in Denver. It's where the project that Democrats had for their ground game was named. Well, in Colorado, looking at the exit polls, single women, one of the core parts of the Democratic coalition, made up more of the electorate in the midterm election than they did for President Obama in 2012. And they voted more for Mark Udall, who was the much maligned Democratic senator running on, war on women, running on abortion and contraception. They gave Udall 6 points more of the vote than President Obama himself received in 2012. So the Democrats got their core vote, and that got one of the big slices of their coalition to the polls. Problem was, almost everyone else was turned off by the tactic of just narrow casting the election to be about abortion and contraception. Single men swung the other way. So Cory Gardner, the Republican senator-elect, actually got 7 points more than Mitt Romney did in 2012, and married men and married women also slightly shifted a little more Republican from the 2012 election. So again, it's an example of the coalition showing up. Democrats did a great job turning out their voters, but there were more voters who sided with the Republicans and more Republican voters that showed up in Colorado. Same thing with Hispanics. Hispanics made up 14% of the vote in 2012. They also made up 14% of the vote in 2014. But more Hispanic voters actually voted Republican in this midterm election. So again, the turning out the vote helped, but it didn't account for the changing shift in the voter mood. North Carolina, another big state. That's the state that has every element of the presidential coalition. In North Carolina, you saw single women, again, the big slice of the Obama coalition, only drop off 1 point in terms of the vote share from 2012 to 2014. And they supported Kay Hagan more than they supported President Obama from that 2-year span. Again, it wasn't enough for Kay Hagan to beat Tom Tillis. So I want to go a little bit more macro to start out, and I guess we can go backwards on the slides all the way back to that first slide about the wave. So like I said, 9 Senate seats, about 12 to 14 House seat game, and you look at that map on the lower right-hand corner, and in terms of land area, Republicans control at least pending some of these recounts, 86% of the land mass in terms of House representation. They control 57% of House seats. It's their largest majority since at least 1946. I think it'll be. They'll pick up 2 more seats when all is said and done, and they'll have their largest majority since the Hoover administration. Republicans, they'll pick up 3 governorships, and they'll net probably 2. They may lose the Alaska governorship, which is still too close to call. But the states where they won, and where they actually won fairly decisively, were really remarkable. You've got Maryland here in our backyard, where Larry Hogan won by 5 points, and won Anne Arundel County with 77% of the vote. Just a truly shocking result in a very Democratic state of Maryland. Massachusetts, Republicans. The big one, I think, is Illinois. Bruce Rauner, who really spent a ton of money. President Obama's home state. President Obama has now lost his old Senate seat. Mark Kirk picked that up in 2010, and now Bruce Rauner has taken, for the Republicans, the governorship in Illinois. So it's across the board, Senate, House, and governorships, a decisive victory for Republicans. My colleague Dave Wasserman at the Cook Report has been tallying the popular vote, the so-called the generic ballot, or the actual, it's not really a generic ballot, the actual House vote. And Republicans now, it says 52.6 to 44.6 on your slide. It's actually been updated over the last day, so it's now about a 7-point margin for Republicans. But when all is said and done, it's going to be anywhere from 6 to about 7 points of a Republican advantage when it comes to the national House vote, which is a decisive total, very, very similar to what we saw in 2010. If we go to the next slide. The big story, and I wrote about this in my post-election column, is, and this is even more than what we saw in 2010, Republicans had quite a bit of success, quite a bit of surprising success in winning in Democratic parts of the country. In 2010, lot of the Republican House gains were actually in some of the most conservative parts of the country where Democrats had made gains in previous midterm elections. The waves of 06 and 08, Democrats lost a lot of those gains and more. But there weren't a whole lot of blue districts where Republicans were able to make inroads. It was mostly a red district pickup. That was very, very different from 2014, where you look at the right now it's about 15 seats Republicans won. Democrats, I believe, picked up 3 seats. So you have a net of 12 right now. But of those 15 seats that the Republicans picked up, 10 of them were in districts that President Obama carried in 2012. So, and I listed all of them on the chart, but you've got districts from New York to Florida to Maine to Illinois, all the way down to suburban Las Vegas in Nevada 4. There are 3 California seats that are Obama districts that are still too close to call. Though that number could jump to 13 districts. So that's a pretty sizable share of Democratic turf that Republicans were able to pick up, a much bigger share than what we saw in 2010, which was also a big wave election for Republicans. In the Senate, the turf was most basically on Republican turf, but the fact that, I said before the election, the test of this being a wave election is whether Democrats, how well Republicans do in the 3 battleground states, or actually the 4 battleground states that are heavily contested. And those were Colorado, Iowa, North Carolina, and New Hampshire. And I said if Republicans win at least 3 of the 4, and that's a clear wave type of situation, they won 3 of the 4, and they narrowly lost the 4th in New Hampshire. Scott Brown lost by 2 points to Gene Shaheen, who was sort of the Bob Corker of 2006, the one Democrat who managed to win in a very challenging environment. And Virginia was another. We didn't even have Virginia on the map, but Ed Gillespie just a few minutes ago conceded the race to Mark Warner, but it was about a 0.9 point margin. Mark Warner had an extremely close race that no one ever anticipated. Again, a sign of the national environment seeping in. And again, like I said, the governorships were probably the clearest example of the wave, with Republicans winning in Illinois, Massachusetts, and Maryland. Paula Page won a 3-way race in Maine, and then you had the Rick Scott, Scott Walker, Rick Snyder, all of whom looked like they were in deep trouble, all of whom got reelected mostly by comfortable margins. So again, the big development is that the blue states, the Democratic-leaning states and districts, many of them flipped to Republicans, which is a big challenge for Republicans. It actually shows that their brand is somewhat, slightly rehabilitated, and it's a bigger change from 2010 when they're the Tea Party was more closely associated with the Republican Party brand. If we go to the next slide. Quickly on the exit polls, there's so much data from the exit polls, and I went over some of the 2 big states, Colorado and North Carolina earlier, but when you look at the national exit polling, this was a gender gap that favored Republicans. Republicans won men by 16 points. They only lost women by 4 points, which is still a sizable gap, but it's one that favors Republicans, unlike 2012 where the gender gap was more favorable to Democrats. Married women voted 10 points, 54-44 to Republicans. Unmarried, 60-38 for Democrats. Nationally, that's a pretty big shift. There was a big focus in certain states, and it paid off in Colorado, for example, for Democrats. But nationally, single women, which voted 67-31 for Obama in 2012, actually flipped 7 points towards the Republican direction and voted 60-38 Democratic in this election. Republicans won, to go back to the 60-38 white voters. That's a constituency the Republicans are gaining ground. It was 3 points better than Mitt Romney's margin in 2012. Republicans still have trouble with Hispanic voters. They voted 62-36 Democratic. They made up 8% of the electorate, the same as in 2010. It was a big drop-off from 2012, and many of them stayed home, but it was actually a loss from the 2010 midterm electorate last time. So again, there's a real challenge for Republicans, and that's going to be a big challenge for them in 2016 as well. This was a very anti-Obama electorate. 44% said that they were good. 44% approved of the president's approved of the president's job performance. 33% said they cast their midterm vote against the president. Only 19% said they were casting their midterm vote for him. So very, like I was saying at the outset, this is a very anxious electorate. You look at all these macroeconomic indicators, including the stock market, the unemployment rate. There was another good jobs report that came out this morning. Voters aren't feeling it. Only 29% said the economy was good or excellent. 70% said it was fair or poor. 48% said that life for the next generation would be worse for their kids than it was for them. That's a 2-to-1 margin over those who thought that it was going to be more optimistic for their kids. A big change from just 10 or 15 years ago. A lot of pessimism in the country. Finally, the second to last bullet, there's a lot of talk about how the Republican brand is like dog food. It's in the toilet. It's in awful shape, and it isn't in good shape. But in the midterm electorate, at least, Republicans and Democrats are pretty much viewed equally unfavorably. Republicans had a 42-54 approve, disapprove. Democrats a 43-55 approve, disapprove. In 2016, it's going to be a slightly more favorable electorate for the Democrats, so Republicans can't really be excited about that number. But when you hear that the Republican Party brand is so much worse than the Democrats, that's not really the case anymore. The events of the last few months have really narrowed the gap in terms of party brand fairly considerably. Go to the next slide. Looking ahead to the future Congress, and I know that's a big focus for all you, is about is there anything, is gridlock going to be the name of the game, or is there going to be progress made in terms of achieving bipartisan compromises? And I actually think there's some silver linings in the makeup in terms of the results of the election and the makeup of the new Congress. First of all, Boehner, who had so many problems dealing with his rightward flank in the last from 2010 onto this election, now has such a big majority that he actually has, ironically, paradoxically, he has more wiggle room to lose the 20 or 30 Tea Party members, the Justin Amash's, the Holzkamps of the world. He could actually lose as many as 30, 32 Republicans that could vote against him. And if Democrats are entirely opposed to what he's proposing, and that's a question mark, but even if Democrats are united, Boehner can lose about 30, 32 Republicans and still be able to pass legislation through the House. Before it was more like 10 to 15 Republicans was the amount of wiggle room. So that's a big development. The caucus is actually more, overall, I would actually say it's a little more moderate, not considerably so, but on one hand, you had a lot of very, very conservative members in conservative districts who replaced establishment-oriented ones, and the big example of that would probably be Wisconsin 6, where Tom Petrie retired, a very center-right, very establishment-minded, a long-time legislator, and he was replaced by a state legislator named Glenn Groffman, who I think you'll be hearing a lot more about. He's going to be the Ted Cruz of the House. He's going to be making a lot of inflammatory comments. It's a very solidly Republican district, but it's an example of when you have a primary and you nominate, the base nominates a more conservative type of Republican, you are going to see those types of districts elect more conservative members. But because there was such a big Republican win in the House, where you'll see as many as, it was 15 Republicans won 15 seats, and most of those were actually in blue districts. A lot of center-right, moderate Republicans replaced Democrats. So like Bob Gold, who was a former congressman from the North Shore of Chicago, he got elected, and he's going to be one of Boehner's biggest allies, and he's going to be pushing the caucus more to the middle. Lee Zeldin in the Long Island district that was long held by Tim Bishop. He is a very moderate Republican, and he's actually going to be the only Jewish Republican. Eric Cantor's loss in the primary has not deprived the Republicans of a Jewish member. Lee Zeldin it will fill that category for the Republicans. But again, it's a Democratic-leaning district. He's not going to be able to be, even if he wanted to get reelected, he's going to have to hew to the center. Elise Stefanik, the youngest woman elected to Congress in history, elected to an upstate New York district that's a very competitive seat. And you look at the list of those blue district Republicans that got elected. They're all going to be close to Boehner. They're going to provide him and provide the caucus with a more moderate sheen than in the past. And I think it's going to actually, now that Republicans have the Senate, you actually may see a lot more compromise and a lot more cohesiveness between the Republican-controlled House and the Republican-controlled Senate. Really, I mean, I think the big questions for the lame duck, will the president go through with an executive order on immigration, which Republicans have said would poison the waters from the get-go, and when they think they can actually reach some agreement on other issues. And the other big question for the lame duck is who will the president nominate as Attorney General. Some reports today suggested that he was going with a real outside-of-the-box selection. I believe her name was Loretta Lynch, the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District in New York, is the leader in the clubhouse. That would be a very interesting pick. I believe that would be a pick that's much more conducive to where Republicans are at. Someone who's not a part of the administration and who hasn't been a part of some of the ideological fights that have taken place in Washington over the last 6 years. So the number 2 point is an encouraging sign for some level of bipartisanship. For Republicans, the question is, will Mitch McConnell be able to pass legislation with bipartisan support? How many Ted Cruzes are there in the Republican caucus? Is it the Republican Senate conference is frankly a lot more center-right, frankly more establishment-oriented than the House counterparts, their House counterparts. But the question is, with Rubio running for president, likely with Rand Paul looking at a presidential campaign with a lot of ambitious Republicans out there, how will McConnell be able to unite his caucus? He can't afford too many defections. And my biggest bellwether in terms of whether Republicans are able to work together and help forge a bipartisan tone in Washington, look at the 4 Senate-elect Republicans, 3 of whom got support from the Club for Growth, 1 of whom got support from Sarah Palin, but all of whom are very close with McConnell and actually temperamentally much more center-right than Tea Party bomb throwers. The 4 that I'm referencing are Joni Ernst in Iowa, Ben Sass in Nebraska, Tom Cotton in Arkansas, and Dan Sullivan, who is not officially a senator-elect but looks likely to beat Mark Begich in Alaska. Are they going to be closer to Ted Cruz or Mitch McConnell? If you read some initial commentary, people think because they were supported by the Club for Growth, because they've taken some votes in Congress that were very much on the rightward side of the House caucus, that they're going to be sort of in that Ted Cruz camp. But having covered many of them, having interviewed them, my sense is actually they're going to be close to Mitch McConnell. They're not going to be as temperamentally oppositional as a Ted Cruz, and I think you'll actually see a lot of these so-called principled conservatives actually play ball with McConnell and help him get legislation passed through the Senate. But keep a close eye on those 4 because they're really going to tell the tale of whether Republicans get things done and move more to the center right, or they really let the Ted Cruz wing of the party take over. We can go to the next slide. Really quickly, I'm glad to take questions on 2016. The big takeaway for Hillary Clinton is that it's going to be a challenge for her to win over the same type of states that Bill Clinton did so well in 92 and 96. She campaigned aggressively in Kentucky for Allison Lundigan Grimes. Bill Clinton spent numerous campaign swings in Arkansas, his home state, to campaign for Mark Pryor. Mark Pryor won 39% of the vote, almost as badly decisively defeated as Blanche Lincoln was in 2010. Allison Lundigan Grimes was actually one of Mitch McConnell's least competitive opponents. She actually lost by a bigger margin than almost every one of the opponents that Democrats had put up against Mitch McConnell. The working class white vote did not make, there was no inroads that Democrats made among working class whites, which is one thing that Democrats thought Hillary Clinton could improve on Barack Obama's performances in that demographic group. So that's one sort of, I don't think anyone ever thought she was going to, totally change the dynamic of the electorate, but it was just the Kentucky and Arkansas results that pour some cold water on Hillary Clinton reshaping the map for 2016. And big picture, Republicans and Democrats don't start 2016 in enviable shape. Republicans need to broaden their coalition. They need to make inroads with minority voters that are making up a larger share of the electorate, and they still haven't proven that they can do so. Though I do think if you look closely at some of these gubernatorial races, John Kasich won 26% of the black vote in Ohio. Bruce Rauner campaigned. I wrote a story about the governor-elect of Illinois a couple weeks ago. Spent some time in Chicago watching Bruce Rauner campaign on the south side of Chicago, campaign in Chinatown, campaign on the west side where Latino businesses predominate. And he really made a big effort to broaden the coalition. There were a lot of other gubernatorial candidates that did the same. So the big test for Republicans in 2016 is, can they cut into the overwhelmingly Democratic support among minorities? If they can't, I think it's going to be a real challenge for them to win a presidential election. And Democrats need to face the tough reality that it's hard for one party to win 3 straight terms in, for president, 3 straight elections for president. The last time that happened, the only time that's happened since World War II was Reagan, and Bush between 80 and 92, and that was when Reagan left office with pretty strong approval ratings. And unless President Obama was able to turn things around sharply in his last couple of years, he could be a big drag on Democratic performance in the next presidential election. So that's a reality that Hillary Clinton, or assuming if she's the nominee or any other Democratic nominee, would face in 2 years. Republican presidential prospects that saw their fortunes improved. Chris Christie in getting blue states turned to flip Republican as Republican Governor Association chairman. That's a big night for Chris Christie. John Kasich winning almost 70% of the vote in Ohio, which no one thought was even remotely possible a year ago. Scott Walker with avoiding a defeat and winning pretty comfortably with 3 wins in 4 years. Those are the big Republican winners. Hillary Clinton, I think, is sort of a wash. Like I said, I think she is the one Democrat that sort of can use her image to be above it all and not have the same baggage that other Democrats might bring to the table. But there were also some very cautionary signs from the results as well. The biggest good sign for Hillary Clinton is that Martin O'Malley, who couldn't bring a Democrat back, he couldn't elect Anthony Brown in Maryland, and O'Malley's horrible approval ratings in Maryland were the big reason why. The fact that Maryland is going to have a Republican as governor is, I think, a death blow to his already small chances to give Hillary Clinton a run for her money. And finally, the final slide. Just some names to watch in really quickly in the coming Congress or in the coming governorships. Senators, you guys probably all know. I mean, I think Tom Cotton is going to be a big figure on foreign policy for the Republicans. Joni Ernst, you're going to be seeing a lot of, just like you heard on the campaign trail. Cory Gardner is going to be a face that Republicans are going to trot out a lot. And Ben Sasse is a big policy wonk, and I think you'll hear him articulating conservative views and ideas for legislation that this upcoming Republican Congress is going to pass. Big Democratic freshman Seth Moulton, the Iraq War veteran, who upset John Tierney in a primary that no one thought he could do, and is now going to be one of the leading, is positioned to at least be one of the leading Democratic voices when it comes to foreign policy. He's from Massachusetts. He's someone to watch, just like Tom Cotton was our up-and-coming Republican congressman last election. Gwen Graham, Florida Democrats had such a thin bench this year that they had to run a former Republican governor for the governorship against Rick Scott. Well, finally they get a candidate in Gwen Graham who won a Republican favorite seat in North Florida, is the daughter of former Senator Bob Graham, a talented candidate, an impressive. I think she'll be a very impressive lawmaker. She's someone who's going to be talked about for statewide office, possibly for the Senate seat that Marco Rubio may be vacating in 2016. So she's a big Democratic freshman member to watch out for. 2 African-American Republicans are headed to the House, in addition to Tim Scott's seat in the Senate. Mia Love, who's pictured in the middle there, she won the Utah House seat, and she's going to be someone who House and Republicans are going to turn to quite a bit, I believe, in the coming months. And Will Hurd, the African-American from a majority Hispanic Texas district, was a big surprise winner on Tuesday night. He's someone who I think will also be seen a lot of, and he could be a future Republican star. And again, the governors, we talked about Rauner, Hogan, and Baker briefly. Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island is the state treasurer. She won pretty decisively, and she's someone who is really tackled the issue of pension reform and fiscal reform in her home state. And I think she's going to be someone to watch for going forward. And finally, Tom Wolf, the other strong note for Democrats on election night, winning a pretty decisive victory against Tom Corbett. And he could be another guy that might be mentioned on a national ticket in coming years. So with that, I turn things over, and if you'd love to hear from any questions about the midterm elections.
Thanks so much, Josh. That was extremely interesting, and I think it's always great to hear the perspective from where you sit as a member of what I would call the political media, and your assessments from this kind of nonpartisan objective lens. And before we turn to questions, what I want to do is add a little more flavor to this conversation. So we've got a few different perspectives, and hear from our political consultants who are on the line, and who are really the ones who now have to kind of interpret what has happened into the work that they do every day, not only for the council, but for their other clients as well. And what I'm curious, among the many things that I'm sure they'll say, to hear is reflecting on Josh's comment around whether the degree to which this was an anti-Obama vote, or was this really people voting for Republicans or maybe against something else, either Democrats or the president himself, and what that might mean as we look forward. And so I am going to first get our Democratic perspective from Rob Leonard. So Rob, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, and why don't you give us a few minutes on kind of your take on what happened Tuesday evening.
Sure, and thank you, Sue, and the Council, and all our listeners for this opportunity. Josh has obviously been very comprehensive in his analysis of the election. I think from my perspective and the perspective of many Democrats, there's no way to sugarcoat this. It was a rout of historic proportions, as Josh indicated. A lot of history adverse to Democrats from the Democratic perspective was made on Tuesday night, and it was clearly a huge political victory. But the distinction I would make is between a political victory, and with that comes the responsibility to govern. And I think governing is going to be much harder than winning the majority in the Senate and adding to the majority in the House, as occurred last Tuesday. Because while the majority changed, and obviously a lot of gavels in the Senate are going to change, and we're going to get some new chairmen as well in the House, some very important ones that may bear on the interest of the Council in terms of the tax writing committees, where we have two new chairmen that will be in place as a result of these elections. But certain things have not changed about governing, and that's the distinction that I would make. This was certainly, in my view, I think in the view of most, a referendum, as most midterm, second presidential term midterm elections are, a referendum on the president. And obviously the president had very low approval ratings going in, and those approval ratings certainly will not improve at all as a result of the election of last Tuesday night. But this, having said this was a referendum on the president, I think it clearly was. This was certainly, from my perspective, I think the perspective of most Democrats, an agenda-less election. Republicans didn't win as well as they did on Tuesday night, based on a new agenda being presented to the American people. This was about the president and how he's doing, and the mood of the country, and the perspective of the country looking ahead, and the dysfunction of the Congress and the government that we've seen, particularly over the last 2 years. And so because the agenda was not really a matter of focus here, it creates a lot of uncertainty about what this new majority, new leadership, is going to do. I think the perspective of most Democrats, there is a lame duck agenda, which I know we'll talk about, Sue, so I won't spend much time on it here. But once we get into this new Congress, there will be opportunities for the Republicans to process legislation, some of which will be bipartisan and acceptable to the president and will get a signature, others of which will be quite confrontational, particularly in the health area, the Affordable Care Act. I think clearly we see confrontation that's occurred in the past in the House is likely to assert itself in the Senate, and the president has already indicated that he's likely to be forced to veto some legislation there. In other areas, I think there will be some bipartisanship, assuming that the Republicans themselves can reach consensus. I do think there's some questions there. Josh identified some fault lines. I'm not saying they're fissures, but fault lines within the Republican caucus, both House and Senate. I think most prominently in the Senate, as to how these new Senate Republicans are going to align themselves once they come to Washington. But assuming that a consensus can be reached in Republican caucuses, House and Senate, and that is an assumption, not a certainty. I think there is an opportunity, will be an opportunity for some bipartisan collaboration, but on a number of big issues, such as health care, perhaps in the energy environmental area, I do think that a lot of the confrontation and contention that we've seen in the past will continue in this new Congress. Just a quick couple of words, and I know you want to quickly get it over to Ken, about the tax agenda. As I said briefly, we will be dealing with two new Republican chairmen of these tax writing committees. Senator Hatch, for sure, in the Senate, chairing the Finance Committee. A little question, I'll certainly defer it to Ken, but from my standpoint, until an election for the new chairman is in fact had, we have to acknowledge that there are two contenders. Paul Ryan, who is the more likely winner of the race, but he is being challenged by Kevin Brady of Texas for the chair. One way or the other, we're going to have a new chairman of both committees. And the issue of tax reform, I think it's been interesting listening and observing the joint Wall Street Journal op-ed by Speaker Boehner and Leader McConnell, as well as what they've said in press conferences, that tax reform has been identified as a priority. I do think that there's a lot of the devil in the detail when it comes to tax reform as to what is meant by it, the scope of it, and that is where the potential implications for the council and its members could come into play. I don't think the Republicans themselves, again, I'll defer to Ken, but from my perspective, the Republicans themselves do not appear to be fully aligned as to an approach to tax reform. And by that I mean whether tax reform is focused exclusively on corporate reform, as some, if not many, in the Republican Party have said, or whether tax reform is more expansive, as the 1986 Act was, and gets involved with issues not only on the corporate side, but also the individual side. And obviously, to the extent that the individual side of tax reform is implicated or brought into the debate and decision-making, that's where there is some very important vulnerability to the council and its members in terms of the treatment of the charitable deduction in a tax reform context. So I know in the interest of time, Sue, I should stop, and I'm glad to, and defer things over to Ken.
Thank you so much, Rob. We appreciate that. And now we want to turn to Ken Keith to see some views from the Republican perspective. Good afternoon, Ken.
Hi, Sue. Well, I'm not going to give views from the Republican perspective. In a program like this, when we're 42 minutes into it, we're dangerously close to a point where it's all been said, and it's all been said by everyone. So what I'd like to do is just identify 4 aspects of this election that haven't been touched on that I think are significant, and then briefly comment about where this may take us. But the 4 things that I'd like to point out are, first, the state races, the state legislative races are a significant development. Republicans will control the most seats at the state legislative level since 1928. They will take control of 11 legislative chambers that they were previously held by Democrats. The most recent one is the House or the Senate in West Virginia, where on Thursday, yesterday, a state senator, it was tied, a state senator previously identified as a Democrat switched parties, which takes the West Virginia Senate into the camp of the Republicans. The reason that's significant is that the state legislatures are the farm teams for the House and Senate at the federal level. And so these developments are pretty significant. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is to touch on a topic that Josh has touched on, but just to add a little bit of further color, and that is the gubernatorial upsets. In Illinois, stunning win, and Rob's quite familiar with Illinois, having worked for Chairman Rostenkowski. The normal pattern in Illinois is that governors go straight from the governor's office to prison. In this case, this is a different situation. He's just going to lose. But the fact that the Republican won there is a suggestion that tax increases have not been very popular at the state level. The Massachusetts loss by Martha Coakley means that her political career is probably over, as she's famously also the person that lost to Scott Brown in the Senate special election to replace Ted Kennedy. Losing this race there is certainly, it can't be helping her political career. Anthony Brown might recover because, in fairness to him, I think he lost because of Martin O'Malley's 44 tax increases in the state of Maryland. And Josh, I think actually Republicans picked up 4 governor's offices because I think Arkansas also switched as well, although I could be wrong about that. All right, so point number 3 is to just point out a story that I think you're going to see a lot more attention to, and it's in the USA Today. The headline is, "How did pollsters miss the GOP tsunami?" And the whole point of the story, which is being raised by others like Larry Sabato and others, is how could these poll numbers be so consistently wrong? In Arkansas, the Real Clear Politics final polling average had the Republican winning by 7. He won by 17. In Kansas, the final average had Roberts losing by 0.8. He won by 10.7. And that's the story consistently. Virginia is another state where they wildly missed. The 4th point, and my final point, is to say as the next 2 years unfold, what you're seeing on the Democratic side of the aisle right now is what happens when a party gets clobbered. And Republicans have got clobbered before, and they've gone through the same thing. And it's the stages of behavior when you have the death of a loved one. So normally it begins with denial, then mourning, and then blame. And the blame game has already started. And the question I would raise is, as Democrats reflect on how well they have done during the period that President Obama has been their leader, are they going to blame him? And the numbers, when you focus on them, are pretty bad. In 2009, Republicans had 60 Senate seats. They'll have 45 in January. In 2009, Democrats had 256 House members. They'll probably have about 192. In 2009, Democrats had 28 governors. They'll have around 18. In 2009, Democrats controlled both legislative chambers in 27 states. In 2015, it may be only 10. And in 2009, Democrats controlled 62 legislative chambers. In 2015, it'll probably be 27. That has to make the Democrats, as they reflect on how well they've done under their president, not feel real positive about supporting his agenda for his final 2 years in office. So then finally, and I'm going to just make one other comment and turn it back to you, Sue, which is, what does that mean we go in this next 2 years? And it's going to be a function of, Rob said, the Republicans are going to have to govern. It's a two-way street. The president is going to have to figure out if he is going to work with them. And if his starting point is to do the immigration reform through executive order, my prediction is very little positive will happen in the next 2 years, because it will so sour the relationship as to make it potentially irreparable. And I would just differ slightly with one thing Rob said. It is true that Republicans did not get elected because of their agenda, but they did get elected because there was a substantial rejection of the president's agenda. Their challenge now is to articulate an agenda that differentiates them in a positive manner from the president. And that may mean passing things that don't get enacted, but it may mean that they need to do things even if they realize they may face presidential vetoes. And that'll be a debate that goes on within the Republican Party as to how do we deal in an environment where we can get some things done, like maybe repeal the medical device tax, maybe eliminating the 30-hour rule under Obamacare, possibly passing the Keystone Pipeline and winning a veto override, trade promotion authority, which they'd like to give the president. Those are some doable wins, But when you get beyond a handful of those things and then start talking about big things like tax reform, it is a very tricky environment to figure out how you could actually reach a compromise that would be acceptable to a Republican Congress and would be signable by the President Obama. So let me stop there, Sue, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much to all three of you. And I have a long laundry list of questions, but we have a short amount of time. And frankly, a lot of what you all covered in your narratives hit on some of the issues that I had. So for the three of you, I want to pose one question that has not come up. And it's something that we at the Council are definitely looking at closely. And that has to do with the lame duck session that we will now head into presumably in the next week or so, that we are all kind of predicting would run through about December 12th, which is the point at which the continuing resolution would either run out or need to be extended. And that is, of course, for our listeners, that provision which allows the government to remain open. It is what funds the government. So we have the lame duck session upcoming. We figure it'll be, you know, maybe a week or two of legislative days long. And one of the things that the Council deeply cares about on behalf of our members are those provisions that are both some provisions that are in the extenders bill, but as we all know, those provisions that address the charitable sector have been lifted out and put into a bill called the America Gives More Act that has a couple of additional provisions in it and would make those extenders permanent. And that was something that the House passed with a relatively good bipartisan support back in June. So we absolutely are concerned about what happens ahead in the next Congress, but we do have this very real, very relevant issue, which is merely days ahead in front of us. So starting with Rob and then going to Ken and Josh, if you guys could each just give maybe 2 minutes or so on what you think is going to happen in the next 4 or so weeks before December 12th with the lame duck session, both on the extenders and what else might get taken up in that time. So to that, Rob, I throw to you.
Okay, and again, in the interest of time, we'll be quick. Our expectation here is that the extenders will be dealt with. Wyden, the current chairman, and majority leader for the moment, Harry Reid, both are very committed to the Finance Committee package, which is a 2-year extension of all of the 55 or so expiring provisions. Whether that package can pass the House or whether it is amended to a 1-year extension, which is one of the rumors. Another rumor is, and again, I'm going to defer to Ken, another rumor is that there are elements of the House that would prefer that nothing be done with the extenders and it all go over to the new year where they will have majorities. There are others who expect that the position of the House leaders and Chairman Camp, that there should be some provisions made permanent, that's a natural compromise where you may get a 2-year extension of most, but a couple like the R&D credit and perhaps a few others would be made permanent. I really do think that the ultimate resolution of the extender package is clearly up to the Republicans, even in the lame duck session, because Reid is going to need some degree of cooperation from McConnell and the Senate Republicans to process any kind of an extender bill. So I do think that the Republican leaders in the lame duck session will have a lot to say on the composition of what happens. But the expectation on the Democratic side is that the extenders will be dealt with for either a 1 or 2 year period. I'll say just this one quick thing about the America Gives More Act. Obviously, that act, that bill has passed the House, permanent provisions, obviously beneficial provisions. So you have an issue there of permanency, but the other thing, there's the one part, and I know it's very important to a lot of people on the call, which is the simplification of the excise tax, the foundation excise tax. That itself is not an extender. And so it does get complicated to accommodate that as a non-extender while saying no, particularly in the Senate, to other provisions that are trying to find their way into the extender package. But again, I think that the extenders will be dealt with, and the ultimate resolution, I think, will be left to the Republicans, McConnell and Boehner, to fill in.
Thanks, Rob. To you, Ken?
Well, I'll go out on a limb and make a definitive prediction, which is the extenders will be done for a 2-year period. That's point number one. Terrorism risk insurance will be reauthorized because that program extends at the end of the year and it's completely bipartisan. The continuing resolution will obviously be dealt with possibly all the way to the end of the current fiscal year, which is September 30 of next year, but maybe into the spring, where things get a little bit complicated because there's the Medicare doc fix expiring in March. Technically, the debt ceiling expires in March too, but it probably doesn't have to be addressed until August because of all the funny things they can do. And there'll be some confirmations that getting the Attorney General's name through will be a little ugly, but it may well happen, and that's it. Now, the good news here is that we should continue the pressure that we've been putting on to get the other aspects of the bill that passed the House that affects foundations. We should continue to support that because when we get to next year, Republicans are going to be looking around for things that can not only pass the House but also pass the Senate and the President may sign. And I think the rest of our provisions could clearly fit into that category. So there's every reason to keep the pressure on until Congress adjourns, which I think probably will be December 12th.
Thanks so much, Ken, and thank you for noting as well the importance of standing firm on the America Gives More Act provisions, because as we all know, these things do carry over from one year to the next, and things don't just sort of die and fall off the tree, and we have to keep up our support, especially signaling to those members of the House who stood up and voted yes on the America Gives More Act. We need to show them our support. So thanks for mentioning that, Ken. And Josh, I'm going to now turn to you and get your perspective in about 2 minutes on what you see in the lame duck.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the politics of the lame duck, I don't think there's any incentive, and I think Rob and Ken detailed this with the specific legislation, but there's really no incentive to really gum up the works. And I think the tone of the next Congress will be set by two things that are going to take place in the lame duck. Number one is the confirmation or nomination hearings for the Attorney General nominee. We don't know officially who that is, but it looks like it'll be there's some reports, at least in the news, that it's going to be the Loretta Lynch, the Brooklyn prosecutor, that is going to be selected. So it'll be very interesting to see how Republican. It seems like that's a more bipartisan selection, if that's the direction that the president goes in. So that'll be a real tone setter for the upcoming Congress. And the next bigger question is whether the president is going to go through with the executive order when it comes to legalizing certain illegal immigrants unilaterally in the country. And at his press conference Wednesday, he seemed to suggest he would be doing that. I think I've talked to some folks close to the White House that have suggested that it's not quite as definitive, and they're still trying to figure out their own strategy. But that would be, I mean, McConnell and Boehner both sort of set their own red line. McConnell, I thought, was fairly conciliatory in his post-election comments. But I think that would be, if the president wants to make progress with Republicans on areas where there is some genuine common agreement on trade, tax reform in particular, throwing the immigration executive order in the mix right before the new Congress is sworn in would be a surefire way to really poison the relationship early on. So I think those are the two indicators to look at, and that's going to, both of them are going to be taking place during the lame duck. Immigration first and foremost, but also how bipartisan the vote is for the new Attorney General nominee.
Thanks so much, Josh. We are coming up on our 1 hour mark. As usual, there's lots and lots that we could say here. I know for those of you who are as interested in these issues as I am, we could probably sit for another hour and listen, but we promised you all it would be 1 hour on your Friday afternoon. And I want to, on behalf of the Council, thank our 3 presenters. This was incredibly informative, helpful, intriguing at some turns, and so thank you very much. To all of those who tuned in. Thank you so much. We had a great number of people participating in this. A few of you did submit questions that we were not able to get to. However, we know who you are, and we are going to respond to you via email. As always, we try to be as responsive as we can on these calls, and so please expect to get an email from us within the next day or so, hopefully this afternoon if we can answer it quickly. If not, we'll get to it as quickly as we can. With that, have a wonderful Friday afternoon, a wonderful weekend, and please stay tuned for future webinars from the Council on Foundations Public Policy and Legal Affairs team that will certainly include tax reform and what's ahead in the 2015 Congress as soon as we know a bit more. Thank you again. Have a wonderful afternoon.